Hello, and welcome everybody to the National Trends in Disability Employment,
or nTIDE,
Lunch and Learn series.
Just a few housekeeping items before we begin.
This webinar is being recorded.
We will post an archive of each webinar each month on our website at www.researchondisability.org/nTIDE.
This site will also provide copies of the presentations, the speakers' bios, full transcripts, and other valuable resources.
As an attendee of this webinar, you are a viewer.
To ask questions of the speakers, click on the Q&A box on your webinar screen and type your questions into the box.
Speakers will review these questions and provide answers during the last section of the webinar.
Some questions may be answered directly in the Q&A box.
If you have any questions following this recording, please contact us at disability.statistics@unh.edu
or toll free at 866-538-9521 for more information.
Thanks for joining us.
Enjoy today's webinar.
Hi everybody, this is Andrew Houghtonville from the University of New Hampshire Institute on Disability. Thank you for joining us today. That's the first time I've had the opportunity to hear the new introduction, and it sounds great. Just an introduction to the nTIDE. So the nTIDE is a monthly webcast. The Lunch and Learn is a monthly webcast that happens on the first Friday, typically the first Friday of every month, and at noon. And we go over the release, the report that was released by us in the Kessler Foundation. The Lunch and Learn is a joint effort between the Kessler Foundation, UNH, and the Association of University Centers on Disability. And it's part of a research and training center on employment and policy and measurement, which is funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, NTIDE. So as we do every month, we're going to start off with the monthly nTIDE report. John O'Neill can't make it today. He's under the weather, so I'm going to do his part. The second part is to hear news from around the country, from Denise at AUCD. And then we have a guest speaker, Crystal from New York City, and we'll hear about a program that they've been running related to employment. So we also follow up with a Q&A section at the end of the program. So part one, so I'm taking over John O'Neill. So the monthly nTIDE report is basically a press release and an infographic looking at the latest statistics that were posted at 8:30 this morning by the U.S. Department of Labor. Basically, these are the data that it's sometimes called the jobs report or the First Friday jobs report put out by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The nTIDE report is a joint effort with the Kessler Foundation and the University of New Hampshire. So these are the official unemployment rates. It's the same source that gives the official unemployment rate. We are going to look at civilians ages 16 to 64 that don't live in institutions. And that's because that's the data that the census, the Bureau of Labor Statistics provides us. The data first became available in September 2008. We are not yet seasonally adjusted, so that's why we compare this month to the previous month last year. And seasonal adjustment we've been looking at, I've been working with graduate students to do that. There's still quite a bit of month-to-month variability that is kind of unavoidable due to the sample sizes. So we're still considering how to handle seasonally adjusted trends. So the numbers. So this month, so we're comparing to last year's December, well, now that we're in January. So December 2017, and we're going to compare it to December 2016. So the employment of people with disabilities went up from 28.7% of people with disabilities are working. Again, this is ages 16 to 64. From 28.7% to 30.8%. So that's a 2.1% percentage point jump. Percentage-wise, that's a 7.3% jump. So percentage points, 2.1 percentage points. For people without disabilities, it went up much less. It went up, but slightly. If you listen to the news, it was basically the news from the general population, from the overall population, was lower than expectations, a bit more sluggish growth than they had anticipated. But it went up, basically a 0.5 percentage point for people without disabilities. Labor force participation rate. Labor force participation rate is not just working, but looking for work. So this suggests that the percentage of people with disabilities increased. The number that were both either working and or actively looking for work increased from 31.7% to 33.8% this past year, which is good. And it's consistent with what we've been finding the last few years, the last 21 months actually. And for people without disabilities, it stayed exactly the same, 76.1 percentage points. And so this suggests again that people with disabilities are working. Not only more people with disabilities are working as a percentage of the population with disabilities, but also more people are actively looking for work. And so they're re-engaging into the workforce. We've been tracking the long-term trend in the employment to population ratio. So here you see the trend lines for people without disabilities, this top line, and then people with disabilities, this bottom line. And really what kind of the story that's coming through, and let me snap in a trend line to make it a little easier to kind of visually characterize the trends. So since 2008, when the Great Recession, so this is just after the Great Recession, you're still seeing fall in employment, but it started to fall before this time series started, before they started collecting data on people with disabilities, or publishing data on people with disabilities. And you see this Great Recession, and really kind of people without disabilities bottomed out in 2000, the end of 2009 through 2010, and then started to slowly recover from the Great Recession. People without disabilities, the recovery really didn't start until the end of 2015, so about a 5-year lag in the recovery for employment of people with disabilities. Of course, this is not to say that there's still a massive difference between people with and without disability, and there's a long way to go. It's nice to see that people with disabilities are participating in the economic growth and recovery that we're experiencing over the last couple of years, but there's still a very long way to go. And so I'm going to turn it over to Denise, who's going to talk about things that are going on to, in part, address that gap in employment between people without disabilities. And then Denise is going to transition into Crystal's presentation and introduce Crystal. So take it away, Denise.
Great. Hi, everybody. So I want to, there we go, first slide. So let me do a quick review of what's going on the federal policy front. We have talked for a number of months about the budget and appropriations process and tax reform and healthcare reform, so I want to make sure I update you. I'm incredibly embarrassed to say that I put January 22nd in because that stuck in my head, and I checked it this morning and it's actually January 19th. So the current continuing resolution expires on January 19th. That means that before the government shuts down, if the Congress doesn't do something about the budget and appropriations process before then. So they are working to pass all the appropriations bills. My guess is what will happen is we'll end up with an omnibus bill with all of the appropriations bills all rolled into one and passed by January 19th. There are still some holdups on that, so we're still not sure that's going to actually happen. There are, and you hear things as you do in Washington kind of every day about what's going to happen or what's not going to happen. The Democrats are trying to include some things like the DACA, the DACA immigration stuff for kids who have been born, who have come to this country illegally with their parents. They still want something on DACA in this bill, this omnibus bill. The CHIP reauthorization is still being urged to go in here. The current continuing resolution has some CHIP continuation in it already, but they still want to do more. On the other side, the Republicans are trying to do an increase in the defense spending that would be included in this. So there's a lot of tension still going on. We'll see if they actually pass something by the 19th. I still would bet that the government won't shut down at that point, that they would, if they aren't in agreement yet, that they will do something else and do another continuing resolution, but we're just waiting to see. As I've said before, other than the things I mentioned just now, predominantly there's level funding in the appropriations bills that are out there for the people that we care about, folks with disabilities, with the one exception that the supported employment line that shows up in the vocational rehabilitation budget is zeroed out. Now, I've gotten lots of questions about that in the past, about whether that means that supported employment under Medicaid is zeroed out. No, if your supported employment is paid for under Medicaid, that's still there depending on what your state is doing. On the other hand, if it's paid for under VR, that program is zeroed out. That probably means that VR in states that provide supported employment will continue to provide it, but they're going to have to find that money somewhere else. And it then would come out presumably out of the regular VR funding, but that's something you should check on in your states. Tax reform, we talked about tax reform before the holidays. And yes, indeed, as I'm sure anyone who reads the newspapers knows, that Congress passed tax reform and the president has signed it. There are some specific things in there. For instance, the medical deduction stayed, the medical expense deduction where you get a deduction over, I think it's 7%, that stayed. Some of the state and local tax stuff stayed with a certain cap on it. The problem with this, there are some things that we lost, but smaller programs, smaller tax deductions. The real problem is that in passing this, the numbers that we hear from most of the bipartisan experts is that this tax reform will mean a huge decrease in the amount of money coming into the federal government. Therefore, it will ultimately lead to pressures to do additional cuts in the near future. Not so much that those cuts have happened now, but that the pressure will be great, and particularly if there's additional money added to the defense budget, that the numbers will be, the pressures will be so great that they'll need to look at cutting entitlements and other discretionary programs as well. There's so much money, there's a decrease in, so much of a decrease in the money that will be coming in that even cuts to discretionary programs probably won't cover it, and they'll start looking at entitlements. In fact, let's lead on to the next point there. House Speaker Paul Ryan has already said that he wants to address entitlement reform during this year. There are some questions about whether Paul Ryan will stay in Congress after this year, whether he'll run again in 2018. So folks are kind of looking at it as it could be his last hurrah to get entitlement reform, which has been his biggest goal in being in Congress. And that's not just Medicaid reform. That would be Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security across the board, or it could be. There is not a lot of, that we hear at least, there isn't a lot of enthusiasm for that on the Senate side. So we'll have to wait and see if it happens, but it's something you absolutely should be on the lookout for. And then lastly, this is something I just wanted to key for you because my guess is that you've been hearing about it, and I just want to tell you what it's about. The Department of Justice withdrew a guidance, a technical assistance guidance on Olmstead. The Olmstead decision, the Supreme Court decision, which says that people with disabilities need to be served in the most integrated environments. So guidance was withdrawn, and various folks within the disability community are reacting differently to that, but generally there's everything from the sky is falling at one end to, the sky is not falling, it's only a guidance at the other. But I wanted you to be reassured that what it says is that while the guidance has been withdrawn, none of the underlying support. So the Supreme Court decision is still there, the legal authority is still there, the responsibilities by states are still there, but the guidance, which has described how states administer employment services and must administer employment services in the most integrated setting possible, has been withdrawn. Is this something to be concerned about? I think it's something to keep an eye on, to be sure. The responsibility is still there. It doesn't change the underlying responsibility or legal requirements, but it certainly could be taken as an indication of the way the administration is looking on Olmstead and also on technical assistance guidance. So I want to make sure you know that I don't think we see that as the sky is falling, but we absolutely see it as something to be to keep our eyes on. Okay, that's the federal policy update. Flip to the next slide. I've got a number of interesting things to share with you that you may or may not have heard about already. The National Council on Disability has come out with a new examination of the early implementation of WIOA's pre-employment transition services by VR agencies and RSA, and there's a link to the report there. It's in a letter. The National Council on Disability, part of its requirements is that it acts as an advisor to the Commissioner of RSA. And so this is their examination on what they see going on WIOA and PREETs. And certainly I've been involved in a lot of conversations about PREETs across the country, how different states are doing it differently, what RSA is saying about it, how it impacts post-secondary education is one of the places I'm involved in it, but also how the discussions are going, or how the implementation of it's going. So this is something that that you might want to go look at. National Council on Disabilities findings and their recommendations. Basically, they have found, as probably we have all heard, that there are questions, any questions going to RSA, either to the VR agency on pets, basically are not being answered quickly enough, and that there are varying answers happening across the country on how PREETs should be implemented, or how particular pieces of it should be implemented and how it applies to particular services. So one of the recommendations is that responses to VR agency questions from RSA should be shared more quickly across all agencies via the WinTAC. That the VR liaisons, the RSA VR liaisons, be provided with consistent answers and be providing consistent answers. That clearly, from NCD's perspective, is not yet happening. Nationwide training to VR agencies on how they can accurately track the PREETs expenditures. There are some comments in this report about how the tracking varies based on the service, how they're defining it in various states. You can imagine some states aren't tracking it at all, although there is a requirement to do so. So that's another one. And then also that there should be some conversation, ongoing conversation with OSEP to develop joint nationwide training for VR agencies and education agencies on how to coordinate on the provision of PREET services. Obviously, this also indicates that that's not happening across the country with any consistency. I would recommend this to you on a couple of levels. Clearly, one of them is it's a good way of approaching your VR agency and saying, you know, this is something that we're looking at. This is something we're concerned about. Here's a study by a national, not just national organization, by a government entity that says that there are some problems. And here are some solutions, and perhaps we can sit down and discuss these problems with you, particularly if those are issues that are happening in your own state. So using it as a resource for your own VR agency, I think, might be a good way to use it, among others, and just to be able to see what else is going on across the country. Okay, next slide. This is interesting. There are a whole series this month of studies, blogs, things that just popped up in my inbox anyway, about participation at various levels of adults with intellectual or physical or other disabilities in research, and at various levels in research. This one is in Disability and Health Journal. It's a qualitative study of attitudes toward the research participation of adults with intellectual disabilities. 512 individuals, including both adults with intellectual disabilities, family and friends, service providers, but also IRB members and researchers. And what they were trying to find out is, what's that perception of having adults with intellectual disabilities participating? What they found was that there was broad support for research about people with ID, but not as broad a support for their direct participation in the research itself, or in the research methodology, particularly with IRB members, and to some extent some of the adults with ID. There's a difference in how the perception is of how that participation should look, whether it is a good thing or not. And there's still clearly some work to be done there. The recommendation of the study is that resources need to be more directly targeted toward health-related research and interventions, specifically addressing the ethical challenges and the perceptions of adults with disabilities in these studies. So not studies about them, but actually participating on the research end of this, and advisory boards and those kinds of things. I thought that was fascinating. And then there's a series of them this month. The next slide. There are a couple of other things that popped up. One of them, and these are health-based, and I would be the first one to say that these are health-based, but I think they clearly apply to the work that you all are doing as well. And my guess is you may be finding some of these same misconceptions or preconceptions. So one in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, by Catherine Spong, who is the Deputy Director of the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development at NIH. And it's about improving public health. That sentence reads incorrectly, but okay. Improving public health requires inclusion of underrepresented populations. That's correct. Sorry, that's correct. So the point being that pregnant women, older adults, children, people with disabilities, and they list people with physical disabilities, intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, are not being studied. These are about other groups within the research, the health research, public health research that's being done. Those groups are generally excluded, and part of what she's arguing is that in what we are now calling personalized research, personalized medicine, that these folks need to be included in the research that's actually going on. I thought in JAMA in particular, I thought that was interesting. And then the next one is on reflections on the contributions of self-advocates to LEND programs. So interdisciplinary leadership development for graduate students in health affairs. The LEND programs, that more and more of the LEND programs are including self-advocates within the LEND cohort. And as such, they're looking at what difference does this make to the other graduate students who are in that cohort? Does it improve their perception of disability, change their perception, and give them a more rounded education, I guess you would say, perception of disability? Clearly the answer is yes, but I thought it was interesting to see that pop up as well. Lots more about self-advocates in research and that, or people with disabilities in research. And I thought that was hugely important as well as really interesting. We certainly talk in the field a lot about nothing about us without us. Or somebody I heard the other day talking about not so much even nothing about us without us, but just nothing without us. And I thought that was fascinating as well. So this is popping up this month. Next one, next slide. Webinar that I wanted to make sure, and this is another one that I thought was really interesting. This is nTIDE is doing this one. It's on January 11th at 3 p.m. Eastern. There's a link to it if you want to register, on engaging families and elevating expectations, and particularly in employment. No surprise to anyone on this call that as we move into competitive integrated employment, both as a result of WIOA and as a result of just the paradigm movement within the field, that there are some changes that we need to encourage in expectations among families and sometimes among people with disabilities themselves. So this webinar is focusing specifically on that, on strategies for engaging families, on innovative parent training. It's with some folks from Indiana University and from Transcend, really good folks in this field, well respected, and I thought this one was really interesting and I wanted to point it out to you. Next slide. Okay, so this one, there are a couple here that showed up in a Mathematica announcements that I've seen. Usually I don't give them to you if I see it's being investigated. I wait till I see kind of the results. But there are a couple of these I thought were really interesting, and so I'm going to pass it along to you. And for those of you who are researchers, I know you can pick up the phone and call somebody and say, so what's this about? And then there will be products as well. This one has to do with migration among persons with disabilities. Again, no surprise to any of us that there are geographic variations in disability prevalence. And the question has been why? In a previous project, the variation particularly with SSDI, it was both the wide variation in the prevalence across the geographic areas. The two reasons: geographic variation in the types of impairment, and perhaps the differences in net migration patterns. So again, no surprise, folks with disabilities or parents with kids with disabilities may relocate based on the differences of what the state provides, or what is available based on not just states, but locales. Next slide. So what these guys are looking at is three components. One, producing statistics that describe the migration patterns, thematic maps, those kinds of things, comparisons of means, regression analysis, etc. And then regression methods to determine the characteristics of areas that could be associated with those migration patterns, and then determining the extent to which the migration accounts for geographic variation. And again, this is something we talk about in the policy world a lot. And so for you folks on the research side, I got really excited, frankly, to see that this is something that somebody's looking at, because from the policy side, we could really use it in the long run in showing some of the state-by-state variations, which is what I think will turn out to be some of what we're talking about here, but we'll see. So thanks to the research folks for doing it. Next slide. And then lastly, this one is one that has had some publication in the past, but I just want to highlight again because there are more things coming. This one has to do with outcomes of youth and young adults seeking VR services. The variations in state agencies and SSDI benefit outcomes. They've got 3 products. There's a working paper summarizing the VR agency statistics on VR participation. And then there are a couple of working papers forthcoming from them on the results of the ones that they're working on. The results of agency staff interviews on potential best practices, which I thought was, again, something that's really useful. And then the outcomes of youth with and without SSA disability benefits. That one ties into some work that I'm also involved in around the Promise grants, and that there are 6 states working on these Promise grants across the country. I'm hoping to have somebody from one of those Promise grants states, as a matter of fact, as the guest speaker on one of our upcoming webinars. My last slide, next one. And again, every month I just remind you that the 2017 Annual Disability Statistics Compendium, so it's happening February 13th, 2018 here in DC. There's a link to register for it. I want to make sure it's on your calendars and you have registered. So that's my part for today. Next slide. I am thrilled to introduce now Crystal Manji. She is from New York City. She'll be talking about, and as it says there, she's the Executive Director for Customer Engagement and Compliance with the Citywide Administrative Services. She'll introduce herself a little bit more in a second. But she's going to be talking about a collaboration between the Mayor's Office and the New York City at Work program and the 55A program, which is the Department of Citywide Administrative Services, around employment of people with disabilities in New York City. So, Crystal, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Hi, Denise. Thank you so much. Can everybody see us? So, yes, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Crystal Manji, and I proudly serve as the Executive Director of Customer Engagement and Compliance in the Human Capital line of service with the New York City Department of Citywide Administrative Services. And for those of you out there that are saying, what is that? I'll say it again a little slowly. So I work for the New York City Department of Citywide Administrative Services, which is one of about 80 city agencies that make up the city's municipal workforce. And I work for one of the bureaus, which is called Human Capital. And one of our responsibilities of Human Capital is recruitment. So I will talk about that a little bit more. And I wanted to just also, before we go to the next slide, is to announce my commissioner, which is Lisette Camilo. And she is the commissioner for the Department of Citywide Administrative Services, which actually supports the city in many different areas of administrative services like fleet and procurement of goods. So DCAS does a lot besides what we're going to talk about today. And I'd also like to also mention Victor Calisi, who is the Commissioner for the Mayor's Office of People with Disabilities. And I'm going to now change the slide. Can you change that slide? And talk about what we're going to get into today and really the collaboration with these two agencies. And I want to bring into the screen my partner, Martha Jackson, who is the Assistant Commissioner for Employment and Business Development with the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. And she's going to also talk a portion about NYC at Work. So that's what we're going to cover today, the content, which is a little bit about DCAS Human Capital, the 55A program, which is the mechanism for which we are bringing people with disabilities into the city, NYC at Work, the diversity job fair that we recently had, which we're very excited about to tell you some of our success, and next steps where we'd like to go. Can I get the next screen? So DCAS Human Capital. Started to talk a little bit about it, but we support the city with all of their critical resources and the support that the city agencies need. As I mentioned before, there are about 80 city agencies. I myself have been with the city for 27 years and have served in 4 of those agencies, so I only have about 76 more to go before I complete my career here. Human Capital, which is one of the bureaus in the Department of Citywide Administrative Services, is responsible for maintaining the civil service system for the city of New York. So 83% of the city's workforce, which is about 325,000 strong, you must take if you are in a competitive position, what it means is that we're going to compete by taking an exam. So what that leads us into is the next thing is the 55A program. Can I get the next screen? So the 55A program, so we want to just make sure everybody understands that the city of New York, we encourage employment for persons with disabilities. But with that being said, and as I spoke before, that for the municipal workforce, most of the positions require taking a written competitive civil service examination. So Section 55A is a part of the New York Civil Service law that allows qualified persons with disabilities to be appointed to such a competitive position without having to take an exam. And that's a big thing, right? So that 55A program is what we look at as our diversity and inclusion program, and that covers only New York City government positions. The state, New York State, has 55B. For the city, it's 55A. Can I have the next slide? So, who's eligible for the 55A program? To be eligible, you first must be certified as having a mental or physical disability, right? Next, you need to be qualified to perform satisfactorily the duties of the position sought, with or without a reasonable accommodation. And third, you must meet the education and or experience for the position sought. For every single position in the city, and we have over 800 competitive titles, there are minimum qualifications and experience that someone must meet. So the law, the 55A law, allows us, for the city of New York, to have 700 positions filled through this program. Can I have the next slide? So who decides if a person is eligible? Well, we have the New York State Office of the Adult Career and Continuing Education Services, Vocational Rehabilitation, also known as Access VR, or the New York State Commission for the Blind. Both Access VR and the New York State Commission certifies persons as physically or mentally disabled and makes determinations as to whether the individuals are qualified to perform satisfactorily the duties of the position sought. So that's what we had talked about before. The person has to meet the minimum qualifications for the position, and then they also have to be matched that they can actually perform those specific tasks for that particular title that they are interviewing for. Can I have the next slide? So the current status of the 55A program. So right now, New Yorkers are working for the city in 55A positions and jobs that are as diverse as administrative managers, clerical associates, caseworkers, construction project managers, auto mechanics, staff analysts, electricians, investigators, stock workers, plumbers, communication managers, sanitation workers. We have it all, and we wanted to get that out there to let people know that the city is very, very large. It has a lot of different positions, and that these positions should be open to everyone, right? So currently, there are 369 positions filled through the 55A program. So that means we got a way to go. We want to hit that 700 number. Once in the 55A program, you're eligible to take promotional exams to become a permanent employee, right? And that's a big thing. So 55A is not necessarily saying that you can't take an exam. What the program is trying to also say is that there could have been times where there has people trying to get a job have been discriminated against because of that disability. So the 55A program opens that door to get your foot in, right? And then after that, you're eligible, serving in that other title, to take a promotional exam and become a permanent employee, right? And that provides career advancement. And that's the heart of what we're getting at. Can I have the next slide? Now I'm going to turn it over to my partner.
So New York City, NYC at Work, is actually the first public-private partnership for employment for New Yorkers with disabilities. The Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities has been around since 1972, and this is the first time that an administration has taken the lead on creating employment opportunities for New Yorkers with disabilities. It is a cross-systems approach to building sustainable pipeline of qualified talent for real meaningful and living wage jobs across New York City and high-growth industries, such as financial and business services, transportation, healthcare, hospitality, and technology. And taking the lead with us is city government. We believe that the city needs to take the lead on creating viable career pathways for all New Yorkers, including New Yorkers with disabilities. And it is also designed to increase confidence in companies that champion the hiring, retention, promotion, and support of employees with disabilities. And one of the ways that we've been able to establish that is through a business development council that we have created over the past year. We started just with 9 businesses, including city government. We now are at 62. Can I have the next slide, please? So NYC at Work is really committed to engaging 2,100 individuals with a spectrum of disabilities. We expect to connect 1,500 to employment in jobs that match their skill set, career goals, and their educational level. Because it is person-centered, we are looking at both full-time and part-time opportunities. Can I have the next slide, please? The Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities is really uniquely poised as the convener for this initiative. On the supply side, we have built a talent coalition of the provider organizations that serve the New Yorkers with disabilities. And on the demand side, our initiative are meeting the needs of a business development council. We're expanding business engagement in all those high growth sectors. And the next. So I'm going to. So this is where we come together. It was an amazing opportunity for Crystal and I to do what we said we've been trying to do for just about a year, and that is make an opportunity possible and create a real career fair for the talent that we are currently working with as part of NYC at Work. And I'll let Crystal take it from there.
Thanks, Martha. So this was where city government comes together and it's at its best. So, we have the Mayor's Office of People for Disabilities and NYC at Work, where they are identifying talented group of people that can work. And this is what the city wants to recruit. We want to recruit talented people. So the two come together. I feel it's like a commercial, right? I mean, the two come together and it's this great thing. So we came up with the idea of doing a diversity job fair. Okay, so how do we do that? And having connection to all of our city partners, as DCAS as the administrative arm, they really are in touch with all of the 80 city agencies. So we reached out and asked people who wanted to be a part of this, and did they have identified vacancies, right? So NYC at Work, thank you for all their hard work. They pre-screened resumes, right? And they looked at the job vacancies that we got from the agencies, and they were doing a match, right? Because we wanted to build for success. And then we brought in Access VR, so that they can also pre-screen and make sure that these candidates are eligible for the 55A program. So you have all these three coming to collide at one, and I have to say it was eye-opening and unbelievably successful on so many different levels. For our partners in the city to be able to interview candidates and see people in a different light was just illuminating. And for candidates to have an opportunity to really sit down and get an interview and get that practice, even if they did not get a position, but just to get people to see them and for them to be able to express the talent that they have, right? I don't know if you'd like to add anything, Martha, but we were very excited, and we can say we've had some success. Can I see the next slide? So we had 5 agencies that came, and we did this, and it doesn't sound like a lot. It was the city saying 80, but we really put this together in, I think, about 3 weeks. So because we really wanted to do something different. And there were 38 job vacancies. 51 candidates were pre-screened, and 35 candidates were invited to the job fair. Altogether, 85 interviews were conducted because candidates actually were interviewed for more than one position. So again, great way to expose both sides, you know, candidates coming and agencies as well. Nothing? Okay, let's go to the next slide. Can we get the next? Okay, thank you. So the city's commitment to equity and inclusion and next steps. So when I say the city, it's always the both of us here working to make some changes. And one of the things that we have already instituted is with our vacancy notices that go out for competitive positions, we have asked all of the agency, all of our 80 agencies to start including this language in their postings. So it's going to say at the end of a regular posting about, you know, the minimum qualifications, it's going to say, please note this position is open to qualified persons with a disability who are eligible for the 55A program. Please indicate on your resume or cover letter that you would like to be considered for a position under the 55A program. Because this is important. It may not sound like a lot, but oftentimes somebody with a disability doesn't realize that a position has to be competitive for them to be eligible for a 55A program. Putting this language on competitive postings will let them know now that they are eligible. So that is a big step forward. And we're also, the city has been offering training to all of our city employees, such as disability etiquette, to get our city partners trained on the appropriateness of doing an interview. And I think that that's been a big step forward for us as well. And then the most exciting is that we want to continue to expand the collaboration that we've already started with the Mayor's Office of People with Disabilities and NYC at Work. We see this as an unbelievable opportunity for city recruitment to meet city recruitment and to be able to market the positions that the city has for people with disabilities to be able to come into city government. I don't know if, what's our next slide? I think that,
Thank you.
thank you. And we'd like to know if anybody has any questions.
Hi, this is Sandra Haltenbell. So that's a really neat program, and it's yeah, you know, as an economist, we'll talk about supply side and we'll talk about demand side, but the devil is in the details of making a match, you know, of having that match occur. And, you know, we'll hear on some of the things that we present over the last few years, you know, employers don't know where to find qualified candidates. And then we'll hear from people with disabilities, it's like, what do you mean? You know, there are lots of qualified candidates out there looking and striving for work. But it's that matching process that it's a very difficult process. And we think that with the internet and monster.com and things like that, things are easier, but actually they sometimes are harder because you get overwhelmed with applications as an employer. And the idea of kind of creating either a job fair or a process by which vacant positions can be potentially filled with qualified candidates, I think that's a really great idea. You know, it's in a way it's really fascinating because it's similar to what we do here. Is when, say, we're a grant-funded shop and somebody loses their funding, right? We go around and look at the other projects and see if people can fill those jobs. So we try to make sure that vacancies are first filled. And the University of New Hampshire overall has this effort to say, okay, someone's lost their job at another college within the university. Can you guys hire this person? You know, just give them a look. It's not a requirement, but it's a give them a look to help. I think it's actually to help the University of New Hampshire's unemployment insurance premium. I think that's you know, but still, you know, it's a way of trying to get someone a first look, and in a way you're developing a system. And I really like the idea that the job posting itself, since these big data programs can be used, you have to have that, you know, 55A in there so that it's searchable, right? And their cover letter needs to have it so that it's also searchable, because there's a lot of decision making that's done before, you know, the managers get to look at resumes. There are people, especially big organizations and federal organizations, there's all this filtering that goes through that, you know, you as a manager, say at HRA, you know, a big organization at you don't even get the resumes because it's already been filtered out. And so making that match, it's fascinating, and I'm glad to see you're getting numbers. And someday I'd love to see kind of a description of who the participants are, what kind of jobs they're filling, and, you know, if there's a way of looking at whether they, you know, they were, you know, former Social Security recipients, whether they went off of Social Security benefits and things like that. I know that data can be done through Access VR, but there's always a big lag in the information that they get from Social Security.
Andrew?
So I'll stop.
Andrew, Andrew, this is Martha. We actually are tracking all of that information as part of our grant. So we will be able to share that.
That's great. That's great. And so the grant is with Kessler and POSIS, is that right?
NYC at Work is funded by the Kessler Foundation, by the POSIS Family Foundation, by the Nielsen, Craig H. Nielsen Foundation, and also by the Institute for Career Development. And the POSIS funds have been matched by the New York State Voc Rehab Agency, okay, which is the first time anything like this has ever happened. So there are a lot of people engaged in supporting this initiative.
That's great. It's interesting to hear that, you know, the match that's going to happen. That's really fascinating. Also, Kessler is a part of the group that puts on this, so I made sure that they got their plug in there. They and POSIS have been working, doing a lot of great things. So there are some questions that we got. It looks like we have some written up. Is there a residency requirement for 55A program?
The residency requirement comes in depending on the particular title, not necessarily the program. So if the person is applying for a position that requires residency, yes, then residency applies. But there are hard to recruit titles in the city that don't require residency. And if that person was applying for that, then they wouldn't.
You also have 90 days.
Yes, once you are selected, you have 90 days the city gives you to move into the city. And then once you are working for the city for 2 years and you become what we call an incumbent, you can then move outside of the 5 boroughs, because that's what we consider the city: Manhattan, Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island. And then you can go to the outer counties like Suffolk County, Nassau County, Rockland County, and so forth, but you would still have to live in the state.
What, but not New Jersey? What's the deal? I grew up
Sorry.
there. So another question we have from someone online is, how are you able to get the other agencies to buy into this? So how did you go about building this coalition?
You know, I have to say
this,
a little bit.
Actually, I'm sorry. This also might be asking the 5 agencies that you got to it might be 2 different questions. So how did you get at work together? And then the second question, which this may be asking instead, is how did you get the 5 agencies to come to the job fair?
I think the at work is really easy because we have Martha, who has been unbelievably enthusiastic and hardworking and wanting to know what we can do differently. I have to give her credit to sit down when we sat down to think about how we were going to celebrate, Disability Awareness Month. It was more about Martha saying, I don't want to do what we've done before. I want to do something different. So it was more about Martha getting us to buy in, not for NYC at work. And once she said that we need to do something different, it was easy. And the agencies, the 5 that we got, these were agencies that had already reached out to us saying that they were interested and wanted to know more about the 55A program. So that was how easy it was to match. And as we move forward to get more agencies to buy in, if you have any recommendations, we'd be willing to take those as well.
So
Yeah,
for the...
I don't have any recommendations for New York City agencies, but I know that, it's New York City is a monolith. I mean, it's so big. And if you can get something to work in New York City, I bet it'd be interesting to see if this kind of approach could be minted in other ways, not at just other big cities, but even in rural areas. There's a potential to have kind of virtual job fairs. And I mean, this is really, for me, I think of this as 2 things. One is it's really possibly a big data issue. Just getting the 55A label into the cover letters of applicants and in the job postings, that makes it a lot easier for the match to be made. And just getting agencies to put the 55, the 5 agencies that came to the job fair, but getting the other agencies to label their postings with the 55A could also help. So a lot of that could happen. I mean, maybe I'm overplaying virtual, because I think people still need to have interviews and do effective interviews. And so I think that's something that's also necessary. But just getting, I hire frequently, and just getting the right resumes in my hands takes a bit of work. And people can be cut out if they're not using the right terms.
Absolutely.
And as part of what we did for this particular recruitment, which is what we're doing for all of our recruitments, even with corporations, is that we're doing all of the pre-screening, and we're helping with the revision with the individual, with the potential candidate, making sure that the resume really reflects not only their skill set, but the job that they are being presented for. So there's a lot of work that's being done up front before that ever happens, because we want to make sure that when a person is going in for an interview, that they are leading with their skills and their strengths, and we want to make sure that they have a good sense of themselves. So a lot of the work is being done up front, which we think is really crucial. And we have a small team here. We have 4 people who are currently working with this, that are reaching out to the individuals, partnering with the DR agencies, We also have people that come to our office that call our 311 number saying, I'm a person with a disability and I really need a job. How are we able to really bring all of the folks, to engage them and really prepare them for the kind of jobs that they have the potential for, they have the skill set for, and that they are motivated to get. And so while we have done this with the city, we're also doing it with private corporations, but to have the city stand behind this, our mayor says the people that work in the city should look like the people that live in the city. And so we're trying to really make sure that through our partnership with DCAS, 55A is really the conduit to make that happen.
Yeah. How does, so now it's just a basic question of how people get to your program. It sounded like you were using Access VR to kind of get potential qualified job candidates, but also people can call in. Is that right? And kind of submit their name? Mm-hmm.
So we're also partnering with the provider agencies. There are multiple agencies throughout the city that have contracts with Access VR and the Commission for the Blind, OPWDD as well, Office for People with Developmental Disabilities. We are partnering with those agencies. We really see them as an extension of the work that we're doing and our staff, because they actually have the talent pool. So we're working with them. We do direct referrals to them. We share the postings with them. We share them with VR counselors. We also, on our website now, have a form that people can fill out and email to us. People can call 311 and say, I'm a person with a disability, I'm looking for work. It's referred to us. And we're also, through colleges, our partnerships with the CUNY, City University of New York colleges, as well as a number of the private colleges here in New York, we've created a college coalition as well, so that we can actually work with those transitioning youth and help them with internships as part of career pathways. So there's multiple ways to get to us, but we also go out into the community and meet with the provider agencies as well.
Yeah, because the reason I ask is that one of the big initiatives at, say, Social Security Administration is early intervention, to get to people as early as possible. You can think of that as transition, youth transition, or from college to the workforce, or from high school to the workforce. You can also think about it as return to work, say, after workers' compensation is done. And so the idea would be, how do you get people into this kind of program early, before they've even applied for Social Security benefits? And, going through, say, sometimes I think with Access VR, or say WeCare, the provider that I'm familiar with down there, it's well along the way to applying to SSI, right? And maybe working with HRA and some of the public services to kind of filter from their, say, the people who are applying for, say, food stamps or emergency cash assistance, to try to funnel people that way. Now, some people don't have, or they're not ready. They don't have resumes necessarily ready to go. But the big key for all these people who are interested in early intervention is, how do you find people, right? And it sounds like you're, trying every possible avenue to find people, and that's you'd wish it was easier. We think the web and everything makes it easier, but I'm still not sure that big data is messy data, and it doesn't always work the way we kind of have visions. So
there are two little things that I can share with you.
Sure.
In response to what you said. One of them is there are transition centers, high school transition centers that are opening. We have two that have opened in New York City already, one in Brooklyn and one in the Bronx. There will be one in the other three boroughs coming up in 2018. And we are actually working with the folks there to establish relationships with the students and their families.
Yeah.
Because they're open in the evenings and on weekends. And then the other piece that While I can't go into great detail, I will tell you that financial education and empowerment is a huge part of what we're doing, and there will be a very new and exciting initiative being rolled out in 2018 directly associated with NYC at Work in terms of creating financial health and wellness connected to benefits counseling. So we can keep you apprised of that as well.
Sounds great. Yes, definitely keep us apprised. Well, thank you both very much. We're at the 1 o'clock mark. Thank you all, Denise and folks at Kessler and others at UNH for helping with this webinar. If we do get any questions for the folks at NYC, we will forward them on to you. So if folks on the phone have more questions, feel free to either contact them directly or can go through us. And so thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Fancy, huh?